The case of Holly Bobo is, at its heart, a profound and enduring tragedy.
It really is.
She was just 20 years old, a nursing student, getting her life started, when she was taken from her own home in Darden, Tennessee, back in 2011.
And what followed was, it wasn't just a search. It became this sprawling legal saga that the sources we're looking at today's show was marked by an almost unbelievable level of complexity and controversy.
It's so important to start by acknowledging the sorrow here for Holly Lynn Bobo and for her family.
Absolutely. Everyone who knew her described her as sweet, shy. She was studying at the University of Tennessee at Martin, living at home with her parents, her brother, just a normal young woman.
And then, her connection through her cousin, the country singer Whitney Duncan, it thrusts this very local, small-town tragedy onto a national stage almost immediately.
Which adds a whole other layer of pressure to an investigation.
It does. And our focus today, for you, is a really detailed exploration of the sources that a listener shared with us. We're not just going to retell the story people might already know.
No.
We're going to try and extract the most critical nuggets of information about the procedural battles, the evidentiary problems, and the core legal controversies that make this case such a powerful and, frankly, a very disturbing study.
So the basic facts for anyone who isn't familiar. Holly disappeared on April 13th, 2011.
And it took 3.5 years, 3.5 agonizing years for her partial remains to be found in September of 2014. Her death was ultimately ruled a homicide.
Specifically, a gunshot wound to the back of the head. And what really defines everything that happens after the abduction is the chaos. The sources just lay it bare. This was an investigation plagued by constant conflict.
Internal and external conflict.
Exactly. You have conflicting initial evidence, you have multiple suspects whose stories just completely change under interrogation, and then, this is the most unusual part, a public, formal severing of ties between the state's main investigative body, the TBI, and the district attorney's office.
It's extraordinary. The more we look into these sources, the clearer it becomes that the conviction that was eventually secured, it was built on a foundation of constantly shifting sand.
A very good way to put it.
Okay, so let's unpack the morning of the abduction. This is April 13th, 2011. The initial sequence of events, seen mostly through the eyes of Holly's brother, Clint Bobo, is absolutely pivotal.
It is because it establishes the physical description of the abductor that for years dominated the entire investigation.
Holly was, by all accounts, very motivated. She was up at 4:30 in the morning to study for an exam.
Her parents had already left for work, so she and her brother were the only ones at the house when everything started to happen around 7:30 a.m.
Right. At 7:30, she's on the phone with her boyfriend, Drew Scott. He was out turkey hunting nearby.
And that call lasts for about 12 minutes. When that call ends, that is the last time anyone successfully communicates with Holly Bobo. Any subsequent calls, any texts, they all just went straight to voicemail or were unanswered.
So we have this incredibly narrow window between roughly 7:42 a.m. and the time police arrive. That's when the crime had to have occurred.
It's an unbelievably tight timeline, and it's just filled with confusion from the very start.
Almost immediately after that call with her boyfriend ends, a neighbor hears a scream from the direction of the Bobo residence.
And that neighbor acted fast, called his mother, who then called Holly's mother, Karen, at her job.
And at the same time, inside the house, Holly's brother Clint is woken up. Not by the scream, but by the family dogs barking frantically.
This is where the tragedy of misinterpretation really begins. Clint looks out into the garage area, and he sees Holly. She's kneeling on the floor near a man.
And this is the critical point. His first assumption, the one he testified to repeatedly.
He thought it was Drew Scott, her boyfriend.
Exactly. He sees them talking. He notes that Holly sounds, quote, very upset and heated. The only words he could really make out were Holly saying, "No, why?"
So you can see how he'd make that mistake. It looks like a young couple having a really bad fight, maybe a breakup. It's a devastating, but you have to say, an understandable assumption.
Until his mother calls. That interpretation is just instantly, horrifyingly corrected.
Karen, Holly's mother, she's just received that concerning call from the neighbor about a scream. So she immediately calls home. Clint tells her what he sees, Holly and a man in the garage.
And her maternal instinct just kicks in. She has this terrible sinking feeling that this is not a boyfriend dispute. And the sources detail the shock of her instruction to her son. She says, "Clint, that's not Drew. Get a gun and shoot him."
Can you even imagine? Clint's reaction was apparently just disbelief. He said something like, "You want me to shoot Drew?"
It's a moment of pure horror.
Yeah.
And it completely shatters Clint's perception of what he's seeing.
He looks outside again, but with fresh eyes this time, and he realizes The man is physically larger than Drew Scott. It's not him. This is an abductor.
He then watches as this unknown man quickly walks Holly, who is still sort of kneeling or struggling, into the woods nearby.
Clint, now following his mother's frantic instructions, he goes and gets a loaded pistol, but before he goes after them, he checks the garage.
And that's when he finds it. Blood stains on the concrete floor. Blood stains that were later confirmed to belong to Holly.
This confirmed it was a violent abduction. That's when he called 911. Police were there just 10 minutes later, but by then, they were gone. Holly and the abductor had vanished.
And the description Clint gave to those first officers on the scene, it became the single most important piece of physical evidence for investigators for the next few years.
He was incredibly specific. The man was between 5 feet, 10 inches, and 6 feet tall, weighed somewhere between 180 and 200 pounds.
And crucially, he noted the man had dark hair that was long enough to cover his neck, and it was sticking out from under his cap.
The suspect was also dressed head to toe in camouflage. Clint described it as either mossy oak breakup or some kind of leafy wear, and the voice he heard. He noted it was very deep and low.
We really have to hold on to this description because it becomes one of the single biggest points of conflict in the entire case down the road.
It really does. Now, beyond the human witness, we can also track the non-human evidence. Holly's cell phone. The pings immediately after the abduction provide this compelling objective confirmation of the direction of travel.
The pings show the device moving rapidly away from the home tower. It's heading north.
Right, north toward Interstate 40. And this is where it gets really interesting. The phone stops moving for a significant amount of time, somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes, in a very specific wooded area.
An area that, as we'll discuss, turned out to be incredibly close to where her remains were discovered years later.
So what does that stop imply?
Well, it suggests something significant happened there. The abductor paused the journey, maybe to dispose of evidence, maybe to dispose of the body, or just to reassess his plan.
And after that half-hour pause, the phone starts moving again. But this time it's heading south, and it's using a different, more winding route.
The final pings were registered in the area where the phone itself and its detached SIM card were later found. It strongly suggests the abductor deliberately disabled the phone's tracking capability at that point.
The entire trajectory suggests someone who knew the area, knew the back roads, and someone who is making a conscious effort to cover their tracks and prevent being followed. It suggests a degree of planning.
The initial phase of that investigation was just massive. Hundreds of searchers were out there. But they only produced these scattered personal items that, tragically just confirmed how quickly Holly had disappeared.
They found her lunchbox, a receipt, her school ID card, and then, as we mentioned, her cell phone. And the fact that the SIM card had been manually removed and was found separate from the phone itself.
What does that suggest to you?
Well, it suggests one of two things. Either panic, a frantic effort to destroy evidence, or conversely, a very calculated, methodical step to erase the digital trail. It's hard to say which.
Now, the immediate focus of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the TBI, it's centered very intensely on one man, Terry Britt.
And it's so important to understand why he was their primary suspect right out of the gate.
He was a registered sex offender, and he physically matched Clint Bobo's description of the abductor, the height, the weight.
And crucially, the sources note he allegedly had a history of stalking blonde women. So for investigators, Britt was a compelling textbook suspect. He fit the profile perfectly.
And the TBI invested heavily in this. They got warrants, they wiretapped and searched Britt's home. They were really trying to build a case against him.
But for reasons that aren't entirely clear in the early stages, he was never formally charged with Holly's murder. The investigation eventually just moved on from him.
But this is a critical point. This initial intense focus on a very plausible suspect, Terry Britt, it becomes absolutely central later on, when the men who are eventually charged present all these glaring inconsistencies.
The fact that law enforcement had a solid description that matched a known offender who fit the profile becomes the entire backbone of the defense's argument years later.
So the case goes cold. It remains a frustrating, agonizing missing persons investigation for 3.5 years.
It's just an unimaginable length of time for the family and the entire state of Tennessee, really.
That search finally, tragically, came to an end in September of 2014. Holly's partial remains were found in northern Decatur County. It was nearly 20 miles from her home in Darden, in a very remote, wooded area just off that I-40 corridor we talked about with the phone pings.
The discovery itself was random. It was unexpected. It was made by a couple of ginseng hunters. One of them, Larry Stone, he testified about it. He described coming across this large old bucket just sitting in the woods.
And when he turned it over,
He saw a human skull underneath it. He then looked around and spotted the rest of her scattered, partial remains spread out nearby on the ground.
it's also worth noting the specific location. The sources are clear. This was on property owned by a family named Tubbs.
That's a really important distinction because early, inaccurate media reports, fueled by the later arrests, sometimes claimed the remains were found on property belonging to the suspects.
Which was completely false.
Completely false. But it's an example of the kind of misinformation that just added to the public confusion surrounding the case.
The remains they recovered were partial, but they were crucial. They had the skull, teeth, several ribs, and one shoulder blade.
And the skull provided the definitive evidence of homicide. Forensic analysis confirmed a bullet hole. The entry point was the back right side of her head. The bullet exited through the front left side, and it fractured her left cheekbone in the process.
So this confirmed it. Death by a close-range gunshot to the head. It ruled out any possibility of an accident and confirmed the violent nature of the crime.
So after the discovery of the remains, the case is officially a homicide, and the investigation starts to focus on this new group of individuals.
And the path to their arrests was winding and just deeply controversial. It's what generated these conflicting narratives that ultimately undermined any sense of certainty about the conviction.
6 men were implicated in total, to varying degrees. And just to keep it clear for you, we can sort of categorize them. You have the core group, Zach Adams, who is the primary defendant and the one who was ultimately convicted. You have his brother, John Dylan Adams. Then there's Jason Autry, who becomes the crucial witness whose testimony secures that conviction.
Then we have Shane Austin. He was central to the early narrative, but tragically committed suicide.
And finally, Jeffrey and Mark Piercy, 2 brothers who faced charges for a while that were eventually dropped completely.
Right. And this is where the entire legal strategy for the state pivots. It moves away from forensic science because they didn't have any, and it becomes all about the shifting story of one suspect.
Dylan Adams.
John Dylan Adams. The investigation somehow led to his arrest on some unrelated federal weapons charges. And it was only after he was arrested and in custody that he told police he had information about Holly Bobo. He claimed he saw her alive at his brother Zach's home shortly after she was abducted.
So let's detail this. Let's call it the first narrative, because this became the initial blueprint for the prosecution, even though it was drastically altered later on.
So what did Dylan claim?
Dylan claimed that on the afternoon of April 13th, 2011, he went to his brother Zach's house to pick up his truck. He said he saw Holly Bobo sitting in a green chair in the living room, and she was wearing a pink T-shirt.
He also said Jason Autry, the man who would later become the state's star witness, was there, just standing nearby.
He went even further. He described what his brother Zach was wearing: camouflage shorts, a black cutoff T-shirt, and green Crocs. And then he made this sensational claim.
The video.
The video. Dylan claimed that Zach admitted to him that he had raped Holly and had videotaped the assault. And that allegation of video became this massive distracting element in the public's perception of the case for a long time.
And immediately there was a major problem with this confession, a problem that really set the stage for all the credibility issues to come.
Dylan Adams later fully recanted this entire story. He alleged she was coerced by investigators. We'll get into the details of that later. And he claimed the whole statement was false.
Even more critically, the narrative he gave police initially was, as the sources say, vastly different from the version the prosecution used 3 years later at Zach's trial. It was a completely different story.
And that alleged videotape of the assault, the centerpiece of his first claim, it was never found. Despite the TBI exhaustively analyzing over 20 different cell phones recovered during the investigation.
So from the very beginning, the state's case is built on a confession that is immediately recanted and contains a spectacular claim about evidence that doesn't exist.
Exactly. And then you have the tragic role of Shane Austin.
Phone records placed him in contact with Zach Adams multiple times during those critical hours of the abduction. It suggested he was involved somehow, either in the crime itself or, more likely, in the cover-up and disposal of the body.
So initially, he was offered this critical lifeline, immunity from all prosecution.
In exchange for what?
In exchange for leading police directly to the location of Holly's remains.
A deal that quickly collapsed.
It fell apart almost immediately. The district attorney withdrew the offer, and he went on the record saying that Austin had, quote, not been completely truthful, candid, forthcoming, or cooperative.
Austin's attorney fought for months to keep him from being charged, but the pressure just kept escalating. And then a year later, in February of 2015, Shane Austin was found dead.
Suicide. In a hotel room in Florida, his attorney publicly blamed his death squarely on the investigators' tactics. He described their methods as a witch hunt that relied on rumor and continuous threats of prosecution, and said it just pushed Austin over the edge, all while the attorney continued to insist his client was innocent and had been cooperative.
And the investigation just kept running down these sensational but ultimately dead-end leads. The case of the Piercy brothers is a perfect example of this.
Jeffrey and Mark Piercy were arrested in July of 2014, and this was based entirely on the testimony of Jeffrey's former roommate, a woman named Sandra King.
And she made another claim about a video.
She did. King alleged that Jeffrey had shown her a very brief video clip. She said it depicted Zach Adams assaulting Holly Bobo, who was tied up and crying. King claimed she saw the clip, but not the actual alleged assault, and she claimed that Mark Piercy was the one who shot the video.
This entire thread just disintegrated under any kind of scrutiny.
It did. Both Piercy brothers vehemently denied any such video ever existed. Jeffrey claimed that Sandra King had misunderstood a conversation he was having about his ex-wife, whose name also happened to be Holly.
And again, the lack of any physical evidence, the video was never found despite all that analysis. It meant the charges against both Jeffrey and Mark were eventually dropped.
And the Piercy brothers and this whole sensational video allegation were essentially erased. They weren't even mentioned in the prosecution's official narrative that was presented at the final trial.
So you see the pattern here. The early investigation was just built on a series of these highly volatile, quickly retracted, or completely unverified claims.
So by the time Zach Adams' trial finally starts in 2017, the prosecution is facing this massive foundational challenge.
They've ruled out their key initial suspect, Terry Britt. They've lost a potential co-conspirator, Shane Austin, to suicide. They've dropped charges against the Piercy brothers. And they still have absolutely no forensic connection to the victim.
The source material is very clear on this. The prosecution's case was overwhelmingly circumstantial. The quote is, no DNA or other forensic evidence tying him to the murder.
So the entire case, its entire viability, rested on one thing.
Getting direct testimony from an accomplice. And that crucial figure was Jason Autry. He agreed to a plea bargain for a significantly reduced sentence. It was a calculated trade. His testimony in exchange for his freedom.
And Autry's testimony became the state's official narrative, but it contradicted nearly every single significant detail of Dylan Adams' initial, now recanted confession.
A completely new story. So let's look at this second narrative, Autry's version, because this is the story the jury ultimately heard and clearly believed.
Autry testified that he was not involved in the initial abduction at all.
Right. He claimed his involvement only began later in the day when he went to Shane Austin's home to buy drugs. He says that once he got there, he saw Austin and the Adams brothers getting rid of evidence.
And crucially, he claimed that Zach Adams had a body wrapped in a multicolored blanket in the back of his white truck.
This new narrative introduced the most gruesome and shocking details of the entire case. Autry testified that he agreed to help Zach get rid of the body. They drove it to the Tennessee River near the I-40 bridge.
And the plan, according to Autry, was to gut the body.
To cut it open, specifically to make sure that it would sink and never float back to the surface.
And this is where the story takes a turn that must have been just absolutely horrifying for the jury to hear. Autry claimed that as they were unloading the body near the river, they made a shocking discovery.
Holly Bobo was still alive.
I can't even imagine. That moment is just, it's impossibly shocking.
It speaks to a level of calculated depravity that's hard to comprehend. And according to Autry, upon this realization, Zach Adams shot her in the back of the head.
They then feared the gunshot had attracted attention, so they loaded the body back into the truck.
Autry testified that Adams later dropped him off, saying he was going to go dump the body near a specific area known as Kelly Ridge.
We have to pause on that detail, because while that's a very compelling story in court, we know from the discovery of her remains that they were found in northern Decatur County.
A significant distance and a completely different location from Kelly Ridge.
So right away, this major discrepancy raises questions about how accurate Autry's knowledge really was, specifically about the disposal site, even if other parts of his story seem to align with some of the evidence.
The prosecution's overall theory at trial had to try and merge all of this. They had the phone data, they had the location knowledge, and now they had Autry's specific details. So they alleged that Austin and the Adams brothers had gone to the Bobo home to teach Clint Bobo how to make methamphetamine.
An allegation that Clint Bobo himself vehemently denied, by the way.
Vehemently. Their theory continued that Holly then came out screaming and hollering after finding them, and that's what triggered the abduction. The prosecution then theorized that Shane Austin was the man Clint described, based on his height and weight, and that all three men then raped her in a local barn owned by Austin's grandmother.
To bolster this, to try and prop up the circumstantial case, the prosecution relied heavily on non-forensic evidence. These contextual details that were meant to paint Adams as a guilty man.
For example, a neighbor of the Bobo family testified they saw a white truck speeding away on the morning of the murder. Zach Adams drove a white truck, so that was presented as a link.
There. And then there was the explosive testimony from Zach Adams' girlfriend at the time, Rebecca Earp.
This was incredibly damaging. She testified that Adams threatened her during an argument. She recounted his exact words. He said he would tie me up just like he did Holly Bobo, and nobody would ever see me again.
A direct, alleged admission of guilt. Another inmate also testified that Adams threatened his own brother, saying he'd put him in a hole beside her if he didn't cooperate.
And finally, the weapon. The prosecution introduced an Arminius .32 caliber revolver. A local man claimed Austin and Autry sold him this gun for drugs and that they'd retrieved it from a body of water.
But this piece of evidence was a real double-edged sword for the prosecution. They had a gun, but they couldn't tie it to the victim.
Precisely. The forensic testing was completely inconclusive. They were unable to link the gun to the bullet that killed Holly through any ballistics tests, and crucially, no DNA, no fingerprints belonging to Adams, Autry, or Austin were ever recovered from it.
So without a definitive ballistics match, the gun just remained circumstantial. It only proved that the men possessed a gun at some point, not the murder weapon.
The fact remains that conviction was secured almost entirely through the testimony of Jason Autry, a plea bargaining accomplice.
So Zach Adams' defense. They mounted an aggressive, very detailed counterattack. Their argument was that Adams was, quote, 100% innocent.
And their strategy focused entirely on one thing, demolishing the credibility of Jason Autry.
The defense asserted that Autry had simply fabricated his entire testimony, and that he only did so after he was given full access to the state's discovery material.
And that is a devastating assertion to make in a court of law. The claim was that Autry, who was a career criminal looking for a way out of a long sentence, simply reviewed all the known facts, the cell phone data, the locations, the witness statements, and then he engineered his elaborate story to sync up perfectly with the evidence the state already had.
Making it sound credible when, in fact, the defense argued it was a manufactured lie designed for one purpose, to secure his reduced sentence.
And this assertion was backed up by numerous physical inconsistencies that directly contradicted Clint Bobo's original eyewitness description.
We go right back to that crucial starting point. 5'10" to 6 feet tall, 180, 200 pounds, dark hair, camouflage.
The Adams brothers and Jason Autry. They were all deemed either too tall, too slim, or too heavy to match this description. None of them were a good fit.
Shane Austin was the only one who was close to the correct weight and height. But Clint had described a man with long, dark hair, and Shane Austin had short, very recognizable red hair.
The key suspects just did not physically match the only direct eyewitness account of the abduction.
And to further discredit the prosecution's entire theory, the defense brought in a powerful and very unexpected witness.
Former TBI agent Terry Dekas, the man who was originally the lead investigator on the case.
He testified for the defense. And in doing so, he revealed this significant internal conflict within the investigation's own history. He stated on the stand that he had actually ruled the charged men out early on based on concrete evidence that the TBI itself had gathered.
This is stunning testimony.
It is. And Dekas outlined several key reasons why he had dismissed the Adams and Autry group. First, Shane Austin, who the prosecution eventually theorized was the abductor Clint saw. He passed a polygraph test.
Second, the alibis provided by the Adams brothers and Autry, they had initially checked out when Dekas first investigated them.
And third, and this is maybe most damaging to the timeline, Dekas highlighted major conflicts in the cell phone data. He stated that the phone records placed Zach Adams and Holly Bobo several miles apart during the critical time frame of the abduction.
Furthermore, a defense expert had analyzed Jason Autry's story. And that expert showed that for the travel time Autry claimed, driving the body to the river and back to a line with the known cell phone pings, the men would have had to maintain an average speed of 106 miles per hour.
On winding, unpaved gravel roads.
It's mathematically, physically implausible. It undermines the entire account from the star witness.
And finally, a palm print was found on Holly's car during the initial investigation. Forensic analysis of that print ruled out the Adams brothers and Jason Autry as the source.
So you have the original TBI lead investigator standing on the witness stand and effectively telling the jury, we already ruled these men out based on alibis, polygraphs, cell phone data, and physical prints.
Based on this profound internal conflict, the defense attorney aggressively contended that the original primary suspect, Terry Britt, was the actual killer. They didn't just mention him. They resurrected the TBI's own initial findings to paint this detailed picture of an alternative, plausible culprit who actually fit the physical facts of the case.
And the defense's case for Britt was robust. He was a convicted sex offender with multiple rape convictions, a history of stalking blonde women, most importantly.
He fit the physical description.
Exactly, the exact physical description provided by Clint Bobo. Moreover, Clint Bobo has played a voice sample of Britt's, and he confirmed it was very similar to the deep, low voice he heard that morning.
So you have both physical and auditory corroboration for the defense's theory.
And Dickus's testimony just reinforced this focus on Britt. He highlighted all the problems he had found in Britt's story back in 2011. Dickus testified that Britt had fabricated an alibi for the morning of the abduction.
He claimed his wife, Janet, was home helping him install a bathtub.
But Dickus discovered that Janet had actually gone to work that morning. And Britt called her and told her to leave work early on the biggest news day in the county's history. And while they produced a handwritten receipt for this bathtub, Dickus couldn't find any record of the sale at the store.
Dickus also confirmed Britt's suspicious behavior after the abduction. He testified that Britt significantly changed his appearance by cutting his hair, which effectively erased that long, dark hair sticking out of the cap detail that Clint had provided.
And critically, that palm print on Holly's car that excluded the Adams Autry group, the handprint could not exclude Terry Britt.
And to put a final capstone on this whole alternative suspect theory, a senior inspector from the U.S. Marshals Service testified that Terry Britt, when he was questioned, once said, "Sounds like you have it all figured out," and he even offered to plead to it.
While the conditions of that potential plea were never specified, it certainly presented a powerful inference to the jury. Here's a man who fits the description, has a history of these exact crimes, fabricates an alibi, changes his appearance, and at one point offers to confess.
So the defense has established this physically plausible suspect with a fabricated alibi and a matching voice. Which begs the question, why did the prosecution risk their entire case and ignore the internal findings of their own state investigators on the shifting, mathematically impossible testimony of a confessed accomplice like Jason Autry?
And the answer, it seems, lies not just in the evidence, but in the extraordinary procedural breakdown that occurred between the state agencies themselves.
The procedural history of the Bobo case is, it's probably the most shocking element in all of these sources. We are talking about a level of public internal warfare between state agencies that is highly unusual and, frankly, deeply concerning for the integrity of an investigation.
The conflict really centered around the district attorney, Matt Stowe. He was elected in the summer of 2014, and he himself acknowledged that his election was likely due, in part, to massive public skepticism over the arrests that had been made and the complete lack of clarity in the legal process up to that point.
And defense attorneys John Herbison and Jennifer Thompson, they leveled some very serious accusations against the DA's office. They alleged blatant stonewalling and strategic manipulation of the court process itself.
Their main argument was that the DA was strategically charging and then dropping charges against men like Dylan Adams and Mark Piercy for a very specific reason: to avoid preliminary hearings.
And this is a critical point that you need to understand. Why would a prosecutor want to avoid a preliminary hearing?
Well, a preliminary hearing requires the prosecution to show their hand, legally speaking. They have to produce a bill of particulars. They have to present some of the evidence to establish that they have probable cause to move forward.
By dropping the charges, the DA could then immediately refile them in a different court, the circuit court, where the defendants were no longer entitled to that preliminary hearing.
The defense saw this as a procedural trick, a way to avoid legal scrutiny and to delay their discovery obligations. They called it playing games with the judicial process.
We see this maneuver play out explicitly with Dylan Adams. Evidence tampering charges against him were dropped just days after he was also charged with rape. And Harbison argued this was done specifically to shift the case from General Sessions Court to Circuit Court, bypassing the preliminary hearing he was entitled to.
A similar pattern happened with Mark Piercy. A scheduled hearing was postponed. Then, right before the rescheduled date, all the charges against him were suddenly dropped. The state's explanation was that it was due to some unrelated federal charges, an explanation Harbison argued was either disingenuous or just ill-informed. He suggested the state simply didn't have the evidence to proceed under examination.
And beyond this strategic charge dropping, the defense complaints about the sheer lack of discovery were relentless. They were constant.
Jennifer Thompson testified repeatedly that evidence the prosecution publicly claimed to have was just never turned over.
The most notable example being that DA Matt Stowe had publicly declared that because Holly was menstruating at the time of her abduction, there was, quote, a lot of DNA evidence recovered in Zach Adams's home.
And Thompson stated emphatically on the record that no DNA evidence was ever turned over to the defense counsel. It was never produced in court against Zach Adams. The prosecution was publicly promising these forensic links that they either could not or would not deliver.
This systemic failure to disclose evidence led to direct judicial intervention.
It did. In December of 2014, a full 9 months after those high-profile arrests, Judge Creed McGinley forcefully expressed his intense frustration with the lack of progress.
He stated publicly, "I am absolutely out of patience with these cases not moving." And he went beyond just frustration. He issued strong, specific orders. He demanded that a bill of particulars detailing the case against Zach Adams be filed within 7 days, and he demanded the immediate discovery of all forensic results.
And yet, the sources document that the prosecution largely ignored both of the deadlines set by the judge.
This procedural conflict just kept escalating, and it reached its absolute apex following that December 2014 hearing.
The dispute over how the case was being handled got so bad that the TBI, the state's primary investigative body, took the almost unprecedented step of briefly dropping its investigation entirely and formally, severing all investigative ties with the entire judicial district.
This is a massive institutional collapse.
It's a meltdown. The TBI's extreme reaction was triggered by direct accusations from District Attorney Stowe. Emails that were later revealed showed Stowe had claimed the TBI was compromising the case by proceeding so slowly that the culprits were always one step ahead.
But the accusations went even further than that. He also claimed the agency was leaking information and possibly covering up evidence.
When your state investigators and your prosecutors are publicly accusing each other of criminal misconduct and sabotaging a murder case, you don't just have tension, you have an outright crisis of confidence.
It effectively ground the official investigation to a halt. The TBI refused to work with the DA's office.
The only thing that allowed the case to proceed was Stowe's eventual recusal from the Bobo case entirely. A special prosecutor, Jennifer Nichols, was appointed to take over.
And that act allowed the TBI to resume its work. But the shadow of all those accusations, of compromised evidence, of misconduct, of stonewalling, it just hung over the case as it finally, years after the abduction, limped toward trial.
So, despite all of this, the staggering evidentiary and procedural conflicts we've detailed, the lack of forensic links, the credible alternative suspect, the internal state conflict, Zach Adams was ultimately found guilty.
Guilty on all charges. First-degree murder, especially aggravated kidnapping and aggravated rape. This was in September of 2017. He was sentenced to life without parole plus 50 years.
Meanwhile, his brother, Dylan Adams, the one who provided that problematic initial confession that started all of this, he entered an Alford plea in January of 2018.
This is a crucial legal concept, and it's important for you to understand it. An Alford plea allows a defendant to maintain their innocence. They don't have to admit to the criminal act. But they formally concede that the prosecution has enough evidence, whether it's reliable or not, that a jury could reasonably find them guilty.
So he takes the deal. He's sentenced to 35 years, to be served concurrently.
Now, the claims surrounding Dylan's initial confession are extremely troubling. They go right to the heart of coercion and unreliable testimony. His family alleged there was extensive pressure during the interrogation process.
The claims included keeping him awake for long periods all night without food or drink until he reportedly just broke down and asked, "What do you want me to say?"
His mother provided even more concerning detail. She alleged that a TBI agent was actively guiding his answers during the confession. She said, "You've got this PBI agent saying, 'Don't you mean this? Don't you mean it happened like this?' And no, Dylan, it went down like this."
It paints a picture not of a free confession, but of an answer being supplied by the interrogator and simply repeated by the subject under extreme duress.
And on top of all that, there was the highly unusual, arguably unethical, technique used with his federal gun charges.
The prosecutor arranged a deal where Dillon would get a no-jail plea on the gun charges, but only if he agreed to move in with a retired police officer named Dennis Benjamin, a man Dillon did not know.
Just 5 weeks after he moved in with this retired cop, Benjamin called 911 to report that Dillon wanted to confess to Holly's murder.
That entire arrangement, which essentially isolated Dillon and facilitated this highly sought-after confession, it came under intense scrutiny as a manipulative tactic that just exploited Dillon's vulnerability to get the result they wanted.
But the truly devastating blow to the conviction's entire foundation came from the state's key witness, Jason Autry.
After testifying against Zach Adams, Autry accepted his plea deal. He got a reduced sentence of just 8 years, which was time served, and he was released in September of 2020. That was the massive benefit he received for his testimony.
The critical new information emerged after his release. Jason Autry fully and publicly recanted his entire trial testimony against Zach Adams.
He didn't just walk it back. He confirmed that the story he told the jury was a fabrication from start to finish. He admitted he simply repeated his known daily routine from that day and then, in his words, added Holly to it to secure his freedom.
He openly confessed that having access to all the evidence through the discovery process, the exact material the defense claimed he used to tailor his story, is what enabled him to synchronize his false narrative with the known facts. The cell phone pings, the locations, the time frames, he used their own evidence to build his lie.
So what this means is that Zach Adams' conviction, a conviction that lacked any corroborating forensic evidence, now rests entirely on a story told by a man who admits he manufactured that story to get out of jail.
And this retraction is the focus of serious, ongoing legal action. Zach Adams filed a petition in January of 2024 to have his conviction overturned, based entirely on Jason Autry's recantation.
Which, if you think about it, effectively removes the sole piece of direct evidence that ever linked him to Holly Bobo's murder.
So, looking back at this comprehensive stack of sources that we've just reviewed, what stands out most clearly is the profound instability of the evidence and the process that was used to get this conviction.
You have a confirmed homicide, a devastating loss for a family and a community, and yet the successful prosecution was built entirely on a series of highly inconsistent and ultimately retracted confessions from individuals who all received significant benefits in exchange for their testimony.
Exactly. The most critical information we've extracted today really concerns that glaring lack of forensic evidence tying the convicted men to the murder. We've detailed the compelling and consistent circumstantial evidence that pointed toward an alternative, physically plausible suspect in Terry Britt.
And we analyzed that almost unbelievable procedural conflict between the TBI and the DA's office, a highly divisive process that just compromised any confidence in the investigation right from the start.
And we can't overlook the compounding effects of all the external factors. The intense national media coverage ensured that misinformation just spread like wildfire.
Reports incorrectly claiming Holly was dragged, not walked, into the woods, or erroneously placing the remains on Zach Adams' family property. All of that just complicated both the public's and the judicial system's perception of the facts.
And add to that the scores of entirely false tips, claims from psychics. It forced investigators to waste countless hours chasing leads that were completely unreliable, all while they were simultaneously fighting these battles internally.
This entire case study raises a really important question for you to consider, especially when we think about the integrity of the justice system as a whole.
The system often has to rely on the testimony of cooperative witnesses, especially when physical evidence just isn't there. But in a tragic and complex case like Holly Bobo's, when a conviction is secured based on the testimony of a witness who gets a massive benefit time served for a murder, and then that same witness later retracts their entire story, claiming it was all a lie, how do we proceed?
The challenge remains. How do we balance the understandable, desperate need to seek justice for a heinous crime and provide some sense of closure for the family with the fundamental requirement for reliable, uncoerced truth? The fact that a conviction still stands, based almost exclusively on testimony that the star witness now admits was a complete fabrication, it means the pursuit of definitive justice in this case is far from over.
Thank you for engaging with this serious analysis of the source material.
Thanks for listening.